June 5, 1944. This 19-year-old German soldier named Franz Gockel sits in a bunker overlooking a beach the Allies call Omaha. The French call it Colville-sur-Mer. He's been told the invasion is coming. He's been told it could be any day. He writes a letter home. The sea is calm. Maybe it won't be today. 12 hours later, Franz is staring at the largest invasion fleet in human history. 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, over 150,000 Allied soldiers coming straight at him. He has maybe 300 men in his sector. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's impenetrable fortress, is about to be tested. Franz Gockel will survive the longest day, but 79 years later, his account of June 6, 1944, will haunt anyone who reads it. "We didn't feel like heroes," he wrote. "We felt like murderers, but we couldn't stop shooting." Today, we're going to experience D-Day from the other side. Not from the landing craft approaching the beach, but from the bunkers defending it. Not from the perspective of liberation, but from the perspective of young men who knew they were fighting for a lost cause, but had no choice but to fight anyway. This is D-Day from the German perspective, and the truth is far more complex than you've been told. To understand what the Germans experienced on D-Day, we need to understand what they had been preparing for. In 1942, after the disastrous Dieppe raid where Canadian and British forces were slaughtered on the beaches, Hitler became obsessed with preventing an Allied invasion of Western Europe. He ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a continuous system of fortifications stretching from Norway to Spain over 2,400 miles of coastline. Millions of tons of concrete, thousands of bunkers, gun emplacements, and obstacles. It would be, he declared, impregnable. But there was a problem. Germany didn't have the resources to make the entire wall equally strong. So the question became, where would the Allies invade? The German High Command was split. Most believed the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, just 20 miles of water separating France from England. It made perfect strategic sense. It was the shortest route. It would give the Allies the quickest path to Germany. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, given command of Army Group B defending the coast, wasn't so sure. He inspected the Normandy beaches and found them suitable for a large-scale invasion. But he was overruled. Pas-de-Calais received the strongest fortifications and the best troops. Normandy got second-tier divisions. What the Germans didn't know was that the Allies had launched the most successful deception operation in military history. Operation Fortitude created an entire Phantom Army group in southeast England, complete with dummy tanks, fake radio traffic, and double agents feeding false information. The Germans were absolutely convinced Pas-de-Calais was the target. By 1944, the German forces defending Normandy were a mixed bag. Yes, there were some elite units like the 21st Panzer Division and crack Waffen-SS troops inland. But on the beaches themselves were divisions made up of soldiers in their 30s and 40s, teenagers as young as 15, and thousands of Ostlegionen, Eastern European conscripts who had little desire to die for Germany. The 716th Infantry Division defending the Normandy beaches had an average age of 36. Many soldiers had stomach ailments and were on special diets. Some battalions were composed entirely of men with ear problems who couldn't serve on the Eastern Front. These were not the supermen of Nazi propaganda. Defending the Normandy coast were approximately 50,000 German troops. On D-Day, they would face nearly 160,000 Allied soldiers, backed by overwhelming air and naval superiority. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. They knew they were outnumbered, but they had no idea of the true scale of what was about to hit them. For the men waiting in the bunkers, life had become routine by June 1944. They pulled guard duty, they reinforced positions, they scanned an empty sea. False alarms were common. The weather had been terrible for days. Storms, High winds, rough seas. No one expected an invasion in such conditions. On the evening of June 5th, many German commanders weren't even at their posts. Rommel had gone back to Germany for his wife's birthday, confident the weather made invasion impossible. Dozens of officers were away at a war game exercise in Rennes, practicing how to defend against an invasion. The irony would be bitter. In the bunkers, soldiers tried to sleep, wrote letters home, or played cards. Some were genuinely confident in their defenses. Others quietly wondered how much longer they would live. Private Franz Gockel, in his bunker above Omaha Beach, later recalled, "We could feel it coming, like a storm. You can't see it yet, but you feel it in your bones." They were right to be afraid. Just after midnight on June 6th, the invasion began, but not on the beaches. American and British paratroopers dropped inland to secure key bridges, crossroads, and causeways. German soldiers woke to the roar of thousands of aircraft passing overhead. Major Friedrich August von der Heydte, commander of the 6th Parachute Regiment, was among the first to realize what was happening. Looking up at the night sky, he saw it filled with aircraft and parachutes. It was like a fantastic dream, he later recalled. Plane after plane after plane. I knew immediately, this is the invasion. But here's where German command structure failed catastrophically. Reports flooded in from all along the coast. Paratroopers here, glider landings there, possible naval movements. But was this the real invasion or a diversion? Confusion reigned. Officers were scattered at the war games. Rommel was in Germany, and Hitler was asleep. German doctrine required Hitler's personal approval to move the reserve panzer divisions inland, but no one wanted to wake the Führer for what might be a false alarm. So, through the critical early hours of D-Day, the panzers that might have made a difference sat motionless, waiting for orders that didn't come. At 5:30 a.m., as dawn broke over the English Channel, German sentries in bunkers along the Normandy coast looked out at the sea and froze in disbelief. Lance Corporal Heinrich Severloh, positioned at Weiderstand's Nest 62 overlooking Omaha Beach, would never forget that moment. At first, we thought they were fishing boats. Then we realized the entire horizon was filled with ships, thousands of them. I had never imagined so many ships existed in the world. An officer raised his binoculars and went pale. "My God," he whispered, "it's the invasion." Within minutes, naval guns opened fire. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers began a bombardment the Germans had never experienced. Shells weighing as much as a small car crashed into bunkers and fortifications. The earth shook. Concrete cracked. Men cowered in their positions, unable to do anything but survive. Private Wilhelm Hoppe, in a bunker at Utah Beach, later described it. The bombardment was like the end of the world. We couldn't hear, couldn't think. Men were screaming, but you couldn't hear them. The bunker shook so hard we thought it would collapse. Some men went mad from the noise. Then came the aircraft, wave after wave of bombers. The sky turned black with planes. Though many bombs fell inland, missing the beach defenses, the psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers who had spent years being told of German air superiority saw nothing but Allied aircraft. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. At 6:30 a.m., the first landing craft approached the beaches. Through the smoke and dust, German defenders could see them coming. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, an endless armada. And then the German machine guns opened fire. What happened next would traumatize men on both sides for the rest of their lives. The Germans called it murder. The Allies called it hell. Lance Corporal Heinrich Severloh manned an MG-42 machine gun in a bunker overlooking Omaha Beach. The MG-42 could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, 20 bullets every second. When the first wave of American troops hit the beach, Severlo opened fire. Years later, he would estimate he fired 12,000 rounds that day and killed over 1,000 Americans. "I didn't think," he said. "I just kept firing, loading new belts, firing, loading, firing. They kept coming and I kept shooting. The water turned red." Omaha Beach was a slaughter. The Americans landed in the worst possible spot, directly in front of the best defended section with minimal cover. German gunners in concrete bunkers had perfect fields of fire down the beach. Artillery observers called in devastating barrages. Corporal Franz Gockel, the teenager we met at the beginning, operated another MG-42 position. His account is haunting. "The first boats came in and we opened fire. Men fell before they even got out of the boats. Some boats took direct hits and sank. The ones who made it to the beach had nowhere to hide. We shot them as they ran. We shot them as they tried to take cover behind obstacles." I kept thinking, these are just boys like me, but I couldn't stop shooting or they would kill us. At other beaches, Utah, Gold, Juno, Sword, the story was different. Better planning, better luck, or weaker defenses meant Allied forces gained footholds more quickly. But even there, German defenders fought with surprising effectiveness given their situation. At Juno Beach, Canadian forces faced fierce resistance from the 716th Infantry Division. Private Werner Kortenhaus, a German machine gunner, described the Canadians' advance. "They were incredibly brave. We cut down the first wave, and they kept coming. We cut down the second wave, and more came. They used tank fire to suppress our bunkers. Then infantry would rush forward. Slowly, steadily, they were pushing us back. We knew we couldn't hold, but we had to try." What's striking in German accounts is how many express respect, even admiration, for Allied troops, mixed with their horror at what they were doing. These weren't monsters. They were young men forced into an impossible situation. But make no mistake, some German defenders fought with fanatical devotion to Nazism. Waffen-SS troops, Hitler Youth members, and true believers in the regime saw D-Day as a fight for Germany's survival. They fought with savage intensity, giving no quarter and expecting none. At Sword Beach, Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Gottberg commanded the defense. A dedicated Nazi, he rallied his troops with speeches about defending the fatherland from Jewish Bolshevik invaders. When British troops overran his position, he fought hand to hand until he was killed. His men found a photo of Hitler in his pocket. The diversity of German motivations on D-Day reflected the diversity of the Wehrmacht itself. Some fought for ideology, some fought because they feared Soviet revenge if Germany lost. Some fought because desertion meant execution, and some fought simply because that's what soldiers do. They fight for the men beside them, even in a hopeless cause. As morning turned to afternoon, the German defenders faced a terrible reality. They were being overwhelmed. Artillery ammunition was running low. Casualties mounted. Bunkers were being knocked out one by one. And where were the reinforcements? Where were the panzers? Still stuck inland, waiting for Hitler's approval to move. By the time the orders came, it was too late. Allied air superiority meant any German movement in daylight invited destruction. Columns of panzers heading toward the beaches were strafed and bombed mercilessly. By early afternoon, German commanders knew the invasion could not be stopped. The question now was whether they could contain it, prevent the Allies from breaking out of the beachheads. But communication had broken down. Phone lines were cut. Radio equipment was destroyed. Officers trying to coordinate defense had no clear picture of what was happening. Some bunkers fought on in isolation, not knowing the positions around them had already fallen. At Omaha Beach, the Allies' bloodiest landing, German defenders had held through the morning. But by 1 p.m., American troops had found gaps in the defenses, scaled the bluffs, and were attacking bunkers from behind. The positions that had seemed impregnable were designed to repel attacks from the sea, not from inland. Lance Corporal Severlow, the machine gunner who had killed so many Americans, found himself surrounded. "We were out of ammunition," he remembered. "We couldn't get supplies. American troops were behind us, beside us. We fought with rifles, with pistols. Then our officer said it was time to retreat or surrender. Most chose to retreat. I ran inland through American fire. I don't know how I survived." Retreat was chaotic. Some units maintained discipline, falling back in good order to secondary positions. Others dissolved into individuals and small groups trying to survive. The roads inland were choked with retreating Germans, refugees, and destroyed vehicles. Allied aircraft hunted them mercilessly. Corporal Franz Gockel managed to escape the bunker complex above Omaha Beach. His account of the retreat is telling. "We ran through the fields and hedgerows. American ships were shelling everything. Planes strafed the roads. We saw German trucks burning, horses dead in harnesses, wounded men screaming for help we couldn't give. I thought, this is what we did to Poland, to France, to Russia. Now it's happening to us." By evening of June 6th, the Allies had secured all 5 beachheads. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's impregnable fortress, had been breached in a single day. Over 150,000 Allied troops were ashore. German casualties were perhaps 4,000 to 9,000 dead, wounded, or captured. But the psychological impact was far greater than the numbers suggest. For German soldiers, D-Day shattered the illusion that Germany could still win the war. They had been told the Atlantic Wall was invincible. They had been promised that any invasion would be thrown back into the sea. Instead, they had witnessed the most powerful military force ever assembled crush their defenses in hours. Private Wilhelm Hoppe, who had survived the bombardment at Utah Beach, expressed what many felt. "After D-Day, we knew. Germany was going to lose. It was just a question of how long and how many would die before the end." In the days after D-Day, German forces in Normandy fought desperately to contain the Allied beachhead. Some units fought with incredible skill and determination. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth, composed largely of teenage fanatics, fought with savage ferocity and committed numerous war crimes against Allied prisoners. But the material disparity was overwhelming. The Allies poured men and supplies into Normandy. Within a week, over 300,000 troops were ashore. Within a month, over 1 million. The Germans couldn't match these numbers or replace their losses. The battle for Normandy would continue for nearly 3 months, a grinding campaign of hedgerow fighting, artillery bombardments, and armored combat. By the time the Allies broke out in August, German casualties in Normandy totaled perhaps 450,000, dead, wounded, or captured. Entire divisions ceased to exist. So what can we learn from the German perspective on D-Day? First, the human dimension of war. The young soldiers defending Normandy weren't all zealous Nazis. Many were ordinary men caught in circumstances beyond their control. This doesn't excuse their service to an evil regime, but it reminds us that war's tragedy extends in all directions. Franz Gockel, the teenager machine gunner from Omaha Beach, survived the war and spent decades speaking to students about his experiences. "I want young people to understand," he would say, "that war makes murderers of us all. I killed men who had mothers and sweethearts, just as I did. I followed orders I should have questioned. I served a regime I should have resisted, and I carry those deaths with me every day." Second, the decisive importance of material superiority. German soldiers on D-Day were often well-trained and highly motivated. Their defensive positions were strong. But they were completely overwhelmed by Allied numbers, firepower, and logistics. The MG-42s and 88mm guns couldn't compensate for having no air cover, limited artillery, and no reinforcements. This wasn't just true on D-Day. It characterized Germany's entire strategic situation by 1944. They were fighting the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States simultaneously. They faced armies that could replace losses and fleets that ruled the seas and skies. German tactical skill couldn't overcome strategic impossibility. Third, the illusion of fixed fortifications. Hitler had invested enormous resources in the Atlantic Wall, convinced that concrete and steel could stop any invasion. But as Rommel had warned, the invasion would be won or lost on the beaches in the first 24 hours. Static defenses, no matter how impressive, couldn't compensate for lack of mobile reserves, air power, and naval support. History has repeatedly shown that walls don't win wars. The Maginot Line failed in 1940. The Atlantic Wall failed in 1944. Defensive mindsets cannot defeat determined attackers with material superiority. Fourth, the danger of believing your own propaganda. German intelligence failed catastrophically regarding D-Day. They expected Pas-de-Calais so strongly that even after Normandy was invaded, many commanders believed it was a diversion. Days after D-Day, substantial German forces remained at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. This failure came from overconfidence, rigid thinking, and a command structure where no one wanted to contradict Hitler or deliver bad news. When reality didn't match ideology, they chose ideology. And finally, the human cost of serving evil. The German soldiers who defended Normandy were serving a regime that had launched a war of aggression, that was carrying out genocide, that had brought nothing but suffering to millions. Many didn't know the full extent of Nazi crimes. Some knew but rationalized. Others knew and didn't care. But by June 1944, there could be no illusions left. Germany was losing. The cause was lost. Yet they fought on, and thousands died for nothing. In the year after D-Day, millions more Germans would die, soldiers and civilians alike, in a war that was already decided. Heinrich Severloh, the machine gunner from Omaha Beach who killed over 1,000 Americans, later befriended American D-Day veterans. They would visit Normandy together, standing on the beach where they had tried to kill each other. "We were enemies for a day," one American veteran said, "but we were both human beings forever." Severloh spent his later years plagued by what he had done. "I was just following orders," he would say, "but that's not an excuse, is it? Those men are still dead, their families still grieved, and I pulled the trigger." Today, Normandy is peaceful. The beaches where thousands died are now tourist destinations. The bunkers remain, slowly crumbling into the cliffs. Memorials honor the dead, mostly Allied dead, because victors build memorials. But walking those beaches, you can still see the German perspective. The bunker apertures that gave fields of fire down the sand. The distances, so short yet so far when running through machine gun fire. The cliffs that had to be scaled under fire. From the German positions, you understand the killing efficiency of their placement. From the beach, you understand the courage required to attack them. The German soldiers who defended Normandy on June 6, 1944, were serving an evil cause. Their regime had started the war, had committed unspeakable atrocities, had brought devastation to Europe. The Allied invasion was necessary, just, and ultimately successful. But the young men in the bunkers were still human beings. They felt fear. They missed their families. Some believed in their cause. Others just wanted to survive. And when they pulled their triggers on D-Day, they became part of one of history's greatest tragedies and one of its most necessary battles. Understanding their perspective doesn't mean excusing their cause. It means acknowledging the full human cost of war on all sides. It means recognizing that soldiers are often just young people caught up in forces beyond their control, making impossible choices in terrible circumstances. D-Day was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Within a year, the Reich would be destroyed, Hitler dead, and Europe liberated. The Allied victory was complete and necessary. But it was purchased at terrible cost. Not just the Allied soldiers who stormed the beaches, though their courage and sacrifice can never be overstated, but also the German soldiers who defended them, many of whom died for a cause that didn't deserve their loyalty, in service of a regime that didn't deserve their sacrifice. War has no winners, only survivors. And on June 6, 1944, on the beaches of Normandy, survival came down to split seconds, blind luck, and the terrible mathematics of industrial warfare. The tide still comes in at Normandy. It washes the beaches clean, just as it did on June 7, 1944, when the blood had finally washed away and the killing had moved inland. But the memories remain, the lessons remain, and the young men on both sides, those who died and those who lived, they remain in the stories we tell, the history we study, and the peace we maintain in their memory. That is the German perspective of D-Day. Not to glorify their cause, but to understand their experience. Not to excuse their service to evil, but to learn from how it happened. Because the lessons of D-Day aren't just about tactics and strategy. They're about humanity, about choices, about the terrible things ordinary people do in extraordinary circumstances. And those lessons, more than any bunker or memorial, must never be forgotten.